We're going to allocate the fair value of all those identifiable assets and liabilities. Then from that, subtract the fair value of the net assets from the fair value of the reporting unit. That difference is going to be implied goodwill. We're going to look at what that implied goodwill is, compare it to what we've recorded goodwill as on the books, and based on that, we may have to write down an impairment. So, qualitative assessment. Based on situations, circumstances currently, we have to decide, is it likely that the fair value is less than the carrying amounts we show in the books? Is it more likely that the fair value is less? If it is, we need to then calculate and compare the fair value to its carrying amount. If it's not, then we don't need to do anything. If we go through step 1 and we're looking to see what's the fair value based on the books to the carrying, or excuse me, based on fair value versus the carrying amount, then if it's not, if the fair value of the reporting is less than its carrying amount, then we are not going to have to do anything. Excuse me, I'm just thinking I screwed up here. Qualitative. In the case, calculate and compare the fair value of the reporting unit to its carrying amount, including goodwill. Is the fair value of the reporting unit less than its carrying amount? If it is less than its carrying amount, then we've probably got some issues that we need to further pursue. Now, when we talk about implied goodwill, again, so much of this can be subjective. If we've got an implied goodwill that is less than what we've recorded on the books for goodwill, we possibly need to record this impairment. So they're stating that we can use market prices, other businesses. We can determine our future cash flows based on present values to determine if in fact the goodwill has been impaired. If we find that the implied goodwill, is not less than the recorded goodwill, we don't need to do anything. But if that implied goodwill is less than that recorded goodwill, we're going to need to report an impairment. The difference between what the implied goodwill is versus what we have shown on our books, we're going to have to show that as an impairment. So, is the fair value of the reporting unit less than its carrying amount? If it is, we're going to compare and try to determine the implied value of the goodwill related to the carrying amount. If the implied goodwill is less than the carrying amount, then we're going to need to recognize an impairment, the difference between the books versus the fair value. So, here's an example. There's 3 different reporting units here: DSM Wired, DSM Wireless, and Vision Talk. We've got the books of Goodwill, $22 million for the Wired, $155 million for the Wireless, and Vision Talk of $38 million. Then we show the acquisition fair value of each reporting unit when we initially acquired the subsidiary. Here are the separate fair values of each of these reporting units. New Call is going to check for impairment of the wireless. The implied fair value of Goodwill is compared to its carrying value using the following allocation of the fair value of wireless at year end. So basically we see the fair values at 748. The Goodwill portion was 155. So basically we're going to take the wireless. Now in 2015 we've got a fair value, instead of 748, we've got a fair value of 600,000. We look at the fair value of all the specific assets as of 2015. We're showing the current, the property, the equipment, subscriber list, patented technology, the current liabilities, and the long-term debt. We assign various values of 596 to the total fair value here of 600. 4 million of this gets applied to Goodwill because that's excess from the identifiable assets. But before we tested for this, the value of Goodwill was 155 million. After we went in testing for this, now our Goodwill is only 4 million. So we have a significant impairment loss on Goodwill of 151 million that then we need to recognize and show as an impairment loss in the year that we recognize this. So instead of having this huge asset sitting on our books, Goodwill, now it's down. The value now is only 4 million. And so New Call needs to show 151 million Goodwill impairment loss in the operating portion of the income statement. It's going to need to disclose what happened, the method they used to determine how they created fair values of that reporting unit, and the reported values of how they determined, how they calculated the fair values. And again, what has been reported as the assets and liabilities aren't going to change in the books. So what happens when we go below zero or below our carrying amounts? So basically there's a method that we use if the reporting unit has a 0 or negative carrying amount. Then you don't even have to deal with step 2 of the impairment test. The entity needs to basically look at the qualitative assessment for how they're going to report the separate units. Under GAAP, Goodwill gets allocated to specific reporting units, and we test basically on a 2-step process to see about impairment. If the carrying amounts are more than the implied value, then we've got to show a loss. But the international standards are a little different. Goodwill gets allocated to certain units that are cash generating. and they basically aren't required to be recognized specifically with each reporting unit as GAAP requires. And under IFRS, there's a one-step process that tests for it. Goodwill gets reduced for any excess carrying value down to 0, and then if there's additional a negative, then we're going to reduce the other assets based on the max of the percentage of those assets to the total. They will get reduced also. When we're dealing with intangibles that have finite lives, we're going to amortize those. The types of intangibles with finite lives basically include those that, based on a legal contract, a regulatory contract, are going to last for a specific period of time and have a specific period of usefulness. Now, basically, even though we start the acquisition anticipating a useful life, that useful life could change. And we need to look at what's happening in the economy, what's happening with the competition, that specific sector, to decide if we maybe need to adjust that economic useful life. If these intangibles with indefinite lives, such as Goodwill, get tested for impairment, we're going to do this annually. Now, they can create a qualitative assessment, as we saw, to see, can they determine if this asset's impaired. If it is, then a quantitative assessment needs to be performed. So they can look at it from a qualitative perspective first, determine it, then a quantitative perspective needs to be performed and compared carrying values to fair values. If fair values are going to be less, then that intangible is impaired and we need to recognize the loss. Now, we've gone through a lot. There's one piece of contingencies we need to look at, but I think what I'd like to do now, for those of you who are interested and willing, is to take some time and to go through some problems. Are you guys good with that? Yes, no, you don't care? Let me pull up the book. Where's my book? Course Smart. Thought I had my book. Well, let me pull up the Course Smart so we can go over a couple problems. So, let me minimize this. And let's look at some of these problems just to start with so we can get an understanding of what we've gone through so far.